Hi, I'm Len Epp from LeanPub, and in this episode of the Front Matter podcast, I'll be interviewing Matthias Noback. Based in Zeist in the Netherlands, Matthias is an author, public speaker, and a software developer, and a trainer and a consultant. You can follow him on Twitter at Matthias Noback and check out his website at matthiasnoback.nl. Matthias is the author of a number of LeanPub books, including PHP for the Web, Learn PHP Without a Framework, Rector, The Power of Automated Refactoring, which he co-authored with Thomas Votruba, and most recently, Recipes for Decoupling. In Recipes for Decoupling, Matthias discusses software design principles and practices you can use to help you future-proof your code to better endure the inevitable changes in any dependencies you rely on and that are subject to inevitable change or obsolescence. In this interview, we're going to talk about Matthias's background and career, professional interests, his books, and at the end, we'll talk a little bit about his experience using LeanPub. So thank you very much, Matthias, for being on the LeanPub Front Matter podcast.
Of course. Thanks for the invitation.
This is the part where regular listeners will know that I normally ask someone for their origin story, but we've already gone over that. 9 years ago, when Matthias was first on the podcast, I know, in 2013. Wow, indeed. That episode was published in January 2014.
Right.
So it's been a long time. So, I mean, although, it's not your entire origin story, 9 years is a long time. And so I was wondering if you could just give us a little bit of a summary of what you've been up to in all that time.
Yeah, that's nice. It's nice to go back to that year and think about how it went back then. Because I just had a regular job, I'd say, as a programmer, and I somehow felt like I wanted to do something different and to write about what I did. So I started blogging, and then in 2014 then was the year that A Year with Symphony was published, the first book on LeanPub. I took the advice. He didn't really personally give me the advice, but Chris Hartjes, who's also publishing on LeanPub, it was like an example. So it looked like he was doing a great job with that, and I thought it would be a nice platform to start writing. And I just never stopped writing. I think that's every year or so, I feel like something else has to be written and has to be published. And so I do that. And LeanPub is still, I think, a great platform for that. Has evolved in several ways, but has also been quite true to the original idea, like being able to publish a book in a very lean way. So very easy to do and easy to make quick updates. So that's what I've been doing ever since. It's sometimes just like, here is something that might be interesting. And next week I'll publish something else that also is interesting. And then together it becomes a book. So it's a good match after all these years. Yeah.
It's great to hear that it's still a good match. And so you beginning with that A Year with Symphony book, you then started in this career as a public speaker and consultant and things like that. And you said that back then you were working as sort of a normal job, but you eventually went independent. Around what time did you make that big leap?
I think within a year after the book arrived. So I really started to look for independent jobs. There was 1 year where I still had a job as an employee at the company, but I soon realized that I really want to be independent, not to stand for any kind of business in particular, but to be in between businesses and help everybody where possible, or maybe not everybody, but to do different jobs in different places and not for a very long time. Although, I don't want to be anywhere for too short a period of time. I just want to know what's going on and really invest some time and energy there, and hopefully do something useful. And this could be many things. So I have done a lot of programming in the meantime, but also indeed like the training part, the consulting part, and between jobs doing the public speaking as well. Although I must say, like since the pandemic, indeed that a lot has changed, and so not as many conferences as back then, not as many flights through Europe, and much more like mostly remote, sometimes meetups still, but a lot less physical contact, I guess, between developers.
Yeah, I'd like to ask you specifically about how the pandemic affected what you do. But before we get there, I'd like to get into a little bit of the details, because a lot of our listeners are people who I mean, it's partly because Leanpub is a self-publishing platform, so people who are interested in that part of what we do are sort of interested. They typically have a little bit of an independent streak and a desire to be a bit more autonomous, maybe, than you might be under other circumstances. And so when you made this leap to sort of leave a kind of regular job, let's say for example with consulting, how do you go about? I mean, then you've learned over the years, but how did you go about finding clients initially, and how do you go about it now? Do they, since you've written and published so much, for example, do they now just come to you, or do you have to go out fishing?
Yeah, not very often. So I rarely get any emails from recruiters or something like just out of the blue companies asking for help or offering me a job or anything. So I'm always a bit surprised about that because it seems to come with a public profile where people just jump on you. On the other hand, I'm quite happy because I wouldn't like to answer everybody to say no or something or actually to look into every bit that's going on and decide if something should be done there. But I do have most of the time it's a really personal moment where a friend or someone I already know or have worked with comes with some new assignment that might be something for me. So I'm happy that this is the way it mostly works. Yeah.
And for those who don't know, what would an example of an assignment be? Would it be that someone at this company is adopting a new framework, and I know this guy Matthias who knows all about that. Should I bring him in? Is that the kind of thing? Yeah.
So my topic then is mostly about architecture, like the bigger picture for applications, how to design them well and keep things maintainable in the long run. But also, how do you work on making a new feature, sometimes a bigger project? How do we do that even? How can we work better together as a team? Work together even on the same feature, which has become known as pair programming or sometimes mob programming. And that's one thing that I really like as well. Working with legacy code is one of my favorite topics, and making something better of that gradually and safely. And
Yeah, I'd like to talk to you about architecture and about legacy code and things like that for sure. Right. On a bit of a higher level, though, I mean, I've asked this question of a number of people on the podcast before, but I think a lot of people might be surprised to hear about that. Programming teams need to have, or it can be advantageous to bring in an outside consultant, right? It would, the ordinary question would be, well, why can't the team handle all of that themselves? Why can't they just learn pair programming, or why can't they just read a book on software architecture and then I'll just make a decision? What's the sort of structural kind of momentum behind the usefulness of bringing in an outside consultant for a team?
Right. Yeah, it's maybe hard to say about my part in that. But the way I think it usually works is that there are some things already going on in a team. There is a need to change something, but it's really hard within the established structure. And sometimes even just because there are forces in the company that prevent change. And sometimes not, it's not on purpose, but it's just the way it is. And it can help if somebody comes in from the outside and starts fresh in a new way, and maybe introduces things in a way that it's less big of a change. So just small things you can do while you're working on your existing work, the issues that you would normally pick up, and do it in a slightly better way. Sometimes that's already very helpful because all those little changes they become the bigger change in the end. But I'm always there for a limited time, so I'm not really sure what happens afterwards. But I'm lucky that most of my clients are companies that I speak with also a couple of months later, a couple of years later even.
Yeah, it's interesting. This isn't so much in the programming world, but often in the world of consultants, it's kind of like I've heard stories and been part of processes where there's some kind of resistance coming from some kind of direction somewhere. And if you can just attribute the change to an external source, you can get away with things that you might not be able to get away with if you just try to do them just directly.
Yeah, it's very helpful for the team that's already working there to be able to say, "Oh, but Matthias said it, and let's do it like he said it," because we are paying him for that. Although I really don't want to be the person that just says what to do, and usually I look for the things that everybody already knows and already wants, and sort of amplify that. Maybe just by talking to a few different people than they are talking to already, or by providing them with additional arguments to make that discussion work.
And I imagine in the olden days, when you got started in the mid 2010s, a lot of basically probably everything was probably in person, right? Where you'd fly or what have you, and you'd go to meet these teams.
Yeah, and that was a lot of fun, but recently, I think, again that pandemic, right, that changed everything. In the beginning, nothing came. Like no company came to ask, can you come over and fly over here and work together with us? It was mostly already remote from the start. Mostly the training programs where I immediately started offering them as remote programs as well, which worked really well. So I still reached those companies, but I didn't go there. And well, in part, I miss it because it's always a lot of fun to be there in a different city and find my way there, meet these people who are very much alike. Like we are all indeed like the technical folks. It's like, we all look the same and talk about the same things. And it's just nice to be with similar people, but in a different place. But yeah, I'm also slightly worried about the environment. That's one thing. It has become clear that all the flying might not be as good as as we thought it could be. And I mean, it has amazing benefits, but I feel like I wouldn't want to do it that much anymore.
Yeah, it's funny. I'd like to ask you specifically about how the pandemic affected you where you live in the Netherlands. But just to share a personal story about transportation and the pandemic. I don't have a car, and I work from home. And at the beginning of the pandemic, I went 9 months without getting on or in any form of conveyance, like no bicycle, no skateboard, no car, no plane. And then I went to visit a friend and his family for Thanksgiving, Canadian Thanksgiving. And within the course of 2 hours, got on a seaplane, a taxi, and a ferry. So I land, sea, and air, all within one sort of brief moment. But it was, I mean, as isolating and sad as so many features of it were, I think, just on a certain level of everybody kind of had an opportunity to kind of assess how they lived their day-to-day lives and whether they needed to live the way that they were. And so, I'm trying to focus on some of the positive things here. So there are a lot of people who will never buy a loaf of bread again because they learned how to make it. And that's nice, and there are a lot of people who maybe realized like, I can walk to the grocery store, get a backpack. I don't need to necessarily drive my car everywhere to do everything all the time and things like that. And just on a very personal note, people finally learned the correct distance to stand apart from each other. It's not distancing; it's called politeness. But in any case, so what was it like for you specifically where you live and given the kind of work that you do? How did it affect you at the beginning, and what's it like now?
Right. Yeah. So it's very weird to get closer together now that it's possible. And I agree that it feels like, okay, maybe it's better not to be that close sometimes. But on the other hand, I think that's one of the things where it sometimes goes wrong for me personally is that I've basically forgot about all the options in a way, like closing everything down and staying at home and canceling so many things. It feels like it's really hard sometimes to get back into the habit of going somewhere, going to the theater sometimes even. And that feels like it's a big thing, and I wouldn't like it to feel like that. So it's just a shame because it can be so much fun, also to be around people. And recently I started playing the violin again in an orchestra, which had also been I used to do this, but it took a lot of effort to go back there.
Yeah, no, I know what you mean. I had a bit of a kind of misanthropic moment the first time I got on a flight after having not been on one, not the seaplane one, but a kind of proper flight where I was in the airport and there was this guy who started whistling.
Oh,
and I'm like, you asshole. There's other people around, we can't not hear your nonsense. And then there was someone talking all these mundane things and someone talking loud on a phone. And I'm like, it's just like, no, this is, get over yourself. People shouldn't do those things, by the way, but at the same time, get over yourself. This is part of living with other people is they're going to fart and they're going to be a bit nonsense and stuff like that. And you kind of become strange again. And maybe it can be a little bit difficult to get used to it. But in your city where you lived, was there ever like a kind of like you can't leave your house kind of lockdown?
No, not really. No, I don't feel like that ever happened.
Okay. Did people start wearing masks outside and things like that?
Yeah, that's right. I think the worst things were being infected, stay home, stay really at home, and making arrangements. But it's funny because within our family, like half of us got infected and the other half not, so they could still do everything. And that would normally have been. They would also normally, like earlier in the pandemic, they would have to stay at home as well. But the rules had already changed, so they could go out, and that would really. I guess it would be really bad if you really had to stay home all the time. The house would be too small, I guess.
And did how did things change for you professionally? So you mentioned it a little bit already, but did the amount of work you had go down or did it go up?
I would say up, mostly because of the training requests, a lot of them remote. And it's interesting because before that, nothing was remote for the trainings. But it makes so much sense because it's just generally very expensive to go somewhere. It takes a lot of time. We have the plane ticket and anything else that needs to be covered, hotel nights before and after the training, and the training day itself. So it's almost like it's very inefficient for everybody. And I'm really happy that it has become more of a standard way of doing this. And it has remained like that. So people are still sending me emails for remote training. That still makes a lot of sense. Although I also know that being in a call and for more than a couple of hours, it's really heavy for everyone involved. So I'm still struggling a bit with that. Mostly limiting the time to 3.5 hours with every hour a break. That's really important to step away sometime. And the afternoon should not be spent behind the computer. So it's a different way of doing it. So it now takes 2 mornings, for instance, instead of one entire day. But it used to be very efficient, like fly there, do the training, fly home, and that's it. Now it's more easygoing. It's really important.
Yeah, that's actually really, really fascinating. I've interviewed a few people who've sort of had to sort of learn new ways of doing things. There was this one woman in particular who worked for HashiCorp. She and her co-author published a book about digital first events. So her job, where there's this company that's fully remote and always has been, and they would have these big events every year, or maybe even more than one. But they were like truly big events, the kind where you book like a big venue a couple of years in advance and stuff like that. And then boom, COVID happened and all their plans collapsed and they had to learn how to do things digitally. Right. And there are these things that like you talk about, like people, you learn that like what's too long, you know what I mean? For people to just be in one session. They learned that to add sort of little bits of entertainment here and there in between things was very useful. But definitely sort of realizing that like, standing or sitting, watching a video and listening to someone talk, in front of a computer is just very different from being sitting in a conference hall or in a meeting room.
very different. And even though in a physical space you can still look at your phone or take out your laptop or something, but if you are behind your computer, it's really hard to not just alt up to a different thing and look at it. And you can see it happen, of course, when everybody has their camera on. It's like there's this gaze at some point in everybody's eyes. And yeah, that's my clue that something needs to change. Like we need to do something different, or have a break, or that.
I saw when I was researching for this interview, I saw that you did a talk with I think a meetup group called DDD, Domain Driven Design Africa, for example, and I think that was during the pandemic, and I was just curious if that kind of thing, kind of virtual meetup, is something that you've seen an uptick in the last couple of years as well.
Yeah, that's right. And in the Netherlands, we had it was quite interesting. Something about 10 different user groups for PHP. Every city had one, and I think a lot of them have disappeared. But on the other hand, the ones that are still there, they are now at least hybrid, doing remote and in some office somewhere, and anybody can join from anywhere around the world. So that's very cool. I think sometimes you would see a meetup being scheduled with a talk that is really interesting, but you can't go there. And now, you can just watch.
You mentioned PHP, which gave me a great opportunity to segue into the next part of the interview, where we'll talk a little bit about the books that you've written in the past, and the kind of work that you do as well. You mentioned legacy code and software architecture, and we'll talk about both those things. But a big area of focus for you has been PHP. So I was wondering, imagine someone's listening to this and they have no idea what that is. Can you explain for a moment what PHP is?
Right. PHP, well, I should say, has become a very serious language that is used for many web applications, many big ones. I don't know the numbers, but it seems that the internet runs on PHP, or at least we like to believe that. And we have some great tools for that, some very good frameworks, also some very good supporting tools for writing maintainable code, like static analysis tools. They have become very big recently, or I would say maybe even in the last couple of years. So any kind of issue that you might run into when you deploy an application, you can already figure them out just when you're still working on the code, and you will get all of these errors and warnings and things. But also, and this is something I've been writing about as well, you mentioned the Rector book, we have automated refactoring tools, and that's a very, very powerful thing for PHP that has become, or is still becoming, more popular in the past few years. So
it's interesting, these questions of popularity, and PHP, or the web runs on PHP. So for those, so PHP is a programming language that's used by people to make stuff you'll interact with on your computer, on the internet, as it were, in your browser and stuff like that. And it's been around for a long time, which is sort of a very important feature. And one of the features of it having been around for a long time is that there are lots of kind of older sites and things like that were made by people who maybe were just kind of throwing things together, without having sort of, maybe it was a lot of stuff in the early days was very on the fly, and PhD was around during what we'll put in quotes, the early days. But you said it's become so. So how have things changed in the last 9 years around PHP? Maybe if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, but I think that's interesting, and I also feel like, okay, I have to defend myself here, which is also a very interesting thing happening all the time, in particular with books. I've had 2 books published by more traditional publishers, A-Press, which was totally open to PHP books, but I had some discussions with Manning, and they really didn't want me to write a PHP book because of these issues, right? So if you say it uses PHP code samples, then it's like, okay, leave it. Like the bigger developer community is not interested in that. And what I think is interesting is that back then in 2014, there were a lot of PHP developers who were suddenly taking PHP much more seriously than had been done before. And this resulted in a lot of interesting developments. Like we have an excellent package manager since about that year, which allows you to install packages in a very safe way, so with locked versions and everything. And that has opened the door for a lot of interesting developments. And some packages have been really become very important, and it has taken a different route than, for instance, the JavaScript package manager stuff, where it's like really small packages and like just functions here and there. But with PHP, you always get these very powerful packages and frameworks as well. And I think they have taken a lot of inspiration from other languages that have come a very long way to develop very good frameworks. So they picked some of the good stuff from these frameworks and these other languages and put it into their own language. To the point that that maybe you could say that like PHP being the flexible language and everything is possible, you can easily make mistakes, but the tools are so very powerful right now that that there is really no need to be defending the language choice anymore today. Just of course steer away from maybe the bad parts or I don't think there are any dangerous parts at this moment, like back then maybe, but everything is covered for you.
And so on that note, thank you very much for sharing that really great explanation and for hinting at the sort of controversies that can sometimes surround, what type of language are you coding in and stuff like that, for people who are listening who might not know, just like in any profession, there are trends and things that are popular and things that are unpopular and things where people get very, people can get very emotional about like styles of handwriting if you're in a certain kind of world. And just imagine how much more heated it might get if, a typo made a program break or something like that. Exactly. And people can get very, very, very sensitive about things like that. And so on that note, let's maybe move on to talk a little bit more specifically about what legacy code is. So you write a lot about legacy code. What is legacy code?
Different definitions are there. We could talk about code that has no tests. This is Michael Fedder's definition. Like people may say that yesterday's code is legacy code in the sense that, well, we may not like it that much as we did it yesterday when we wrote it and it was all great. Now when we look at it again, it's like, not that great anymore. So we feel like we want to improve it. If you multiply this, then you have, and also look back longer than a day or a week or a month, then you end up with just a big project, like thousands of lines of code that are not up to your current standards. And what to do with that? Can you improve it somehow, or should you rewrite it entirely? Basically throw it away and make something new. That's really really difficult. It's a difficult question to answer anyway. I've been part of several projects that were just rewriting entire projects, and they were successful with that. And some where, it was just what it was, and this is just our reality. We have to deal with the mess, and we can do little things, but not that much, because it's very easy to make it unstable.
Yeah, so one definition is just old code. I think another definition is code someone else wrote. Exactly. And it's sort of funny, but sometimes that someone else can be you from 5 years ago, and you're like, I have no idea what I was thinking.
That's right.
And so there's this sort of decision that people can often make. So you can maybe think about it. One can maybe think about it from the perspective of, let's say you're an MBA manager. You don't know the first thing about coding, but you understand everything else about the business, and you're sitting on top of something that's starting to break down, that isn't working anymore. You may be even having a difficult time recruiting because there's new programmers, because they ask what they'd be working on, and they go, oh my God, I don't want to work on that. And so you're this manager, you've got a budget, you've got things that are kind of working, and you realize at some point, look, we're just going to, just to stay where we are in terms of functionality, we're actually going to have to do a lot of work. And that can mean rewriting, which you mentioned, which is, one can think of that just what it sounds like, starting over, basically. Or you can refactor. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what refactoring is.
That's another definition. So we I think it's Martin Fowler. We want to improve the structure of the code without changing its behavior. Because structure is indeed, it's about mess, the code being a mess, and you feel like, this should be cleaned up. But we don't want to break existing features because people are relying on it for it to work like this. And so, yeah, we can just clean up, but preserving existing behavior. And that's already a very hard thing to do because the system may have behaviors that we don't know about as developers. So we make this change here to clean it up, and then we break something for a particular user that was relying on this feature to work in a particular way.
Yeah, and that brings with it all kinds of decisions. And we've used the word architecture a couple of times already. But you can come in and go, okay, what are we going to do to maintain the functionality, but maybe change the architecture of the code? Can you give us maybe an example of what that would be like? Yeah, maybe if you can think of an example of sort of this kind of thing in practice, where it's like I'm gonna try and keep the functionality, but I'm gonna make some sort of structural changes to the code. What would an example of that be?
Like this is related to the topic of my latest book as well, like trying to decouple from things that are dangerous to couple to. So this is indeed about structure. If you pick a framework or a particular library that does something useful for you, but you get too intimate with it, you are using its maybe too many parts that it offers, even though it's nice today. In a couple of years, it's outdated, and you no longer want that. So one way is to say, I can use this framework in this part of the code base, but in this other part, I'm not letting it happen. So there we focus on just code that, we can design it in any way we like, but it's not coupled to a particular tool. That's one example.
Okay, so this is very interesting, actually. Yeah, so moving on to your latest book, Recipes for Decoupling. So let me see if I can try and sort of explain this. Let's say you're developing a website, and it's going to do, I don't know. Let's say it's a calendar. It's going to be a cool calendar kind of thing that helps people deal with time zones and stuff like that. And one thing this website might do that you're building, or this app, for example, that people might be able to install on their phone or something like that, is send emails. And if your code that you write is using a specific email service, that's an example of coupling, right?
Right. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And so if for example that email service that you rely on changes because it's got programmers working on it and it's got things that it depends on and stuff like that. If it changes, then all of a sudden you might wake up one morning and everybody's all your users are jumping up and down going, I'm not getting my emails anymore.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
And if you haven't taken into account in the way you coded it, for example, if there's something specific in your code that's unique to the thing that you were using, then you're screwed. But if you coded your own thing at a level of abstraction appropriately with decoupling, right, then you could just switch to another service like that.
Right. That ideally, yes. One example is that if you send emails in 10 different places in your code base, and you have this 10 or 20 line thing that you copy all the time, every time you want to send an email, it's a very clear example of something badly designed, because indeed if you have to do something about that email sending part where you need to configure it in a different way because the service changed or it needs to go to a different web address or something, then you have to change it in all these places. So of course the first step is to find a single place in the code where we can do that, and then maybe the next part is that if this happens, if we really have to switch very quickly, we can do that without changing the entire code base.
And I gather it's also a very important principle for testing as well, which is something we haven't spoken about yet. But there's something called test-driven development, which actually Chris Hartjes has written about, who you mentioned earlier, the grumpy programmer.
Exactly, yeah.
But if, for example, let's talk a little bit about test-driven development in a moment. But one thing you can do when you're coding an application is write in tests, automated tests in there, so that you sort of just on your computer, you can just sort of run the program and you can test something and you should say run the program, and then these automated tests can happen and they can flash red lights at you, basically saying,
Right.
This is broken. But what you don't want is to have to actually, like, for example, with this example we were using, you don't want to have to actually send a real email in order to test, right? And so you'd have some kind of abstraction. Oh, this is an email, and then you'd have something set up that sort of goes, I can check to see that the category of email kind of activity is working properly.
That's right. Yeah. And so this is, but I mean, everything is related always with these topics, because like legacy code, like code that somebody else wrote, something like that. But what is usually bad about it is that person knew how it was supposed to work, and they probably didn't specify that. So that they just wrote the code and clicked on something in the browser and saw it happen. And we're like, okay, this works, so it can be released. But years later, you want to go back and still see, like, what was the purpose of this code, because you want to, again, clean it up. And for this, you can also use the tests to specify what is the expected behavior. What you'd really like is that back then, this person would have written the test for you instead of you having to figure it out and maybe write some tests after the fact. Or
this is actually a really interesting example of how things can be, these different sort of software principles can be interconnected, right? So, for example, you can imagine, software code is writing. It's a bunch of instructions that are written down, basically. And if you're going to be examining some code, you open up a text editor and you look at some letters and numbers and spaces and new lines and things like that, and you sort of like, what's this? And one way of doing it is to have no explanations of anything that's going on whatsoever, and just have someone have to figure out, I know this programming language, and like, let me see, I see what this is, and I look around and I can see what this little thing I'm looking at is doing. Another thing you could do is have the code, the instructions that are to send an email, and you can write above, the following code was written in order to send emails, right? And so now if someone comes in, new to the project, they can go, okay, I know this is the part where it's sending the email. Well, this all of a sudden, this can make it a lot easier. And another thing you can do is actually write a test there, an automated test, and so the test that you write is itself a way of saying this is going to be sent. This next part of the code is trying to send an, or the former part of the code is trying to send an email. So writing test is a way of documenting at the same time about what a section of code is trying to do. And that all sounds great. Well, why doesn't everybody write these awesome tests every time they're coding? Or why don't they just write out this next part of the code is to send an email? And the reason is that keystrokes take time. Basically, and they can take your focus away. For example, like if you're really getting into if you've built up a sort of stack in your head of sequences of steps, stepping out of it to explain what you just did actually can kind of break the mental house of cards.
That's right.
So if let's say, for example, you're brought in, to bring it down to an example that you might face. So let's say you're brought in as a consultant to a team, and they're like, we're thinking of moving to this test-driven development thing where we write, as we develop our code, we write tests every step along the way. But our manager doesn't want us to do that because then he doesn't hit the milestones that he's expecting to hit. What do you do to sort of convince the manager that they should switch to test-driven development?
If I knew the trick, then it's hard to say. But if you talk about this, there are so many aspects to it. One is the thing that you mentioned. You don't want to send actual emails when you're testing the email functionality, because that would maybe cost you money even, or it would be very slow. And where do you even send the emails to? I don't know, all these questions. So you find something else to replace that and to make it a bit faster, a bit more deterministic as well. But if you don't write tests, like if you never write any tests, then you don't have that feedback from the code. Like, this is badly designed code because it's hard to test. And if you have hard to test code, then you're very likely not going to do any testing anymore, because it's such it's an amazing amount of work if you want to test untestable code, and it takes just a lot of time to extract parts that are testable and then replace them with something like those replacement objects that can do the thing in the testing scenario for you. But starting anywhere, what works for me is that if a team wants to pick up an issue, the first question should always be, how are we going to test this? And in some cases, it might end up with a quick discussion and a simple answer. We cannot test this. It would just be too hard. But okay, at least we define the criteria for testing as like in the issue description itself. So we say, how can we test this? Or how can someone else verify that this works? Okay, go there, click on this, and okay, it should look like that. But very often there are more options. You don't have to just rely on manual verification. You can actually write an automated test, even if it's hard at first. And this is another approach that I do for legacy programming. It's the Mikado method. So we always look for the simplest thing possible that we can do today to improve the situation a bit. And then for every new issue that we pick up, we at least improve one part of it and make our lives a bit easier. And in the end, this results in much more tests, and we feel like it's easier to write tests. And when it becomes easier, we are also going to do it more often.
Yeah, I'm looking at a recent blog post of yours here on moving forward with legacy code and the Mikado method. And
right.
Just to give people a bit of a sense, again, of the kind of training that you would do. So what is the Mikado method?
Yeah. Okay. Also, you say Mikado. I wasn't aware. Like in the Netherlands, we say Mikado. So
well, don't go by my pronunciation of anything.
No, I was just interested. It's a game. I don't know. I don't know if you have the game as well, where you have the sticks and you drop them on the table, and you have to pick each stick one by one, and make sure that none of the other sticks move. I don't know. So if that's something. Oh,
that is something, but I forget the name. That is definitely something, yeah.
The stick game, maybe. I don't know. But anyway, so this is an approach that I do. So we imagine like there is this big goal. For instance, we want to migrate to a different framework, which is just a lot of work. So how can we do that? Well, Mikado is like we do the first thing that we could try, like a very big thing. Sometimes even we just install the next framework, and then we realize it's not going to work because we don't have the right language version. Like it should be PHP 8 if we want to use that framework, and we are on 5. So okay, there's a lot of work there, and we write it down as a prerequisite. So we know that before we can ever install the framework, we first have to upgrade the language. And that's something that may take some time. And yeah, like the next time we have some time to pick up work on this issue, we do that. We just switch to a different language, and we notice that there are all kinds of errors that suddenly pop up, and we write down all of those errors, and one by one recognize that these are prerequisites. If we ever want to migrate to a new version, we need to fix those errors first, because we can already anticipate the language switch, and so all the way down to the smallest thing that you can do to improve the situation, and finally the switch to the framework. It's just a commit, maybe just a few lines of code, and there you go, it's done. But for every step in the process, you end up with a better code base anyway. Like the situation is much better today, and you don't have to wait until it's finally done and you can do this like big merge into the main branch and deploy, because that's a very dangerous thing. Then if you have this big bang release, you're never sure if everything is going to work on that day. No.
Yeah, your fingers get very sweaty when you press enter on that,
right?
Or you click a button. Thanks very much for sharing that. That's super interesting. I wanted to move on to the next part of the interview where we talk about your latest book specifically. So in Recipes for Decoupling, you talk about something called PHP Stan. And I was wondering if you could just sort of tell us about what that is and its history and how you use it in your book.
Yeah, I think, PHP Stan it stands for PHP Static Analysis. So it's a tool that you can run on your PHP code. It looks at the code. It doesn't run the code, but it will say that, you're calling a method that requires a string, but you pass an integer to it, for instance. That like just very low level things where, it can already predict that something will go wrong when you do this. And that's very useful because usually there's so much code in your project. You make a change, you don't often realize all the areas that it may have an impact on. And this tool can scan your entire code base and look for potential errors.
And how does that work? I mean, how can it it's not the program itself, so how can it know that something might be an error?
Right. Yeah. So it really tries to understand your code. And the first step is loading each file and then parsing it. So trying to recognize the structure. For this, it builds on top of another library called PHP parser. So it can understand the building blocks. So this is a class, and in this class, we find a number of functions. Every function has a number of arguments with their types. And yeah, PHP Stand just goes by them like for each of these blocks and interprets them, and also figures out like what are the types of things that are happening here. Is it indeed a string type value or an integer type? And so yeah, it really does a lot of interpretation, and by doing so, it's becoming really smart. And like every day, it's becoming more smart, and to the point that it's not just possible to analyze code, but it's even possible to modify code, and that's where Rector, another tool, like builds on top of the static analysis part, and it is able to transform code into like different structures.
I've got a question about that in just a moment, but so the book, I believe, is marked as 20% done, and I just wanted to ask, who's this book for? Who's the ideal reader for this book?
Very good question. Yeah, so it's anyone who has experience with frameworks, and I guess that many developers have this experience, mostly with like web MVC frameworks. So that there are more than just the ones that I know, of course, and there are more than just PHP frameworks. But,
model view controller, right?
Right. Exactly. Yeah. Right. Yeah. So. Like most web applications have this kind of structure where they're trying to serve a browser request and like answer with a response, and all the work that happens in between is something that you can write some code for, but the framework tries to do a lot of things for you, to save you some time usually. But I also know that many developers have experienced some issues with that. So they realize that they are becoming too dependent on parts of those frameworks, and that it becomes really hard to change anything at some point. Sometimes framework authors, they come with a new version, and like developers have to catch up with those changes. Like you have this entire migration guide, and you have to follow that. That's going to be just a lot of work. So over the years, I've collected some things that I do, basically patterns or recipes that I apply to my code to make sure that I'm not too tightly coupled to these frameworks. And yeah, that's this book is a collection of the things that I do.
And you mentioned that PHP Stand can even modify code. And so just before we move on to the final part of the interview, where we talk about your work as an author and published author and things like that. So do you think that code is going to be writing code in the future, and programmers are going to become obsolete, just to put it in the funniest way? Yeah, there's a very serious debate out there about like are the AIs going to be able to write code?
Yeah, I'm not really sure, but before we continue, just to get back to the PHP Stand part. Sure. So PHP Stand only analyzes the code, and Rector can actually change it. So it's a different tool, but it builds on top. Now, just
no, that's an important distinction.
Right, exactly. Yeah. But these are all possible because of like each other. The tools they amplify each other. But about writing code, and I think Rector can show us a bit about that. If you want to migrate to, as an example, a different framework or a different style of programming, you can just do that. You can say, I want this kind of approach to programming, and run Rector, and everything now follows the new standard. So that's very cool. I don't know about AIs. I don't have any experience with that, although there are some tools already available. But I feel like there's still a lot of work in like interpreting what is needed here. We need to talk and have lots of sessions, like understanding what are the needs of the users and how does this business concept work. So I'm not really sure how fast that may happen, although I believe that, yes, of course, this might become closer one day. I don't know.
Oh, well, thanks, Brittman. No, that was a very broad, open question. I was just kind of being selfishly taking the opportunity to see if I could get an opinion out of you. Just moving, yeah, no, it is. It's so fascinating. Just moving on then to the last part of the interview where you talk about your work as an author. So you've followed a very sort of interesting arc, the kind of arc we love to see on LeanPub, where maybe LeanPub is the first place that someone publishes a book, and then maybe they publish another one, but then maybe they publish a book or books with some more conventional publishers, and then maybe they come back to LeanPub. And so you started out sort of self-publishing, but then you did work with A Press and with Manning as well. I was just wondering if you could talk a moment comparing and contrasting the experience of being an entirely independent self-published author versus working with, a company that's going to have development editors and stuff like that. What are the main compares and contrasts that you can come up with?
Right. No, and I think these are totally different things. And I always hope that it's clear also for the readers that there are different standards. And for Manning, for instance, I really enjoyed working with them. They had some very high quality reviews going on, people really involved in the process as well. So they knew what was happening with the book and what it was about. And that's just great to be able to talk about the book with someone and who is really knowledgeable on the topic. They have many people you can just ask for, can you review this? And they just have people for that. It's great. They can contact some pool and everybody will just join and have very valuable feedback. So what was very useful for me was the broad range of feedback from them, looking from different languages, different experience levels, and also learning what they had in mind for what is a good technical book. So that they really spend a lot of time also communicating that, which was very interesting. I've learned a lot. So back in the beginning when I started with LeanPub, make my own book there, there wasn't even a technical review going on for some time. Sometime later, a couple of books later, I asked some people to provide a review because it really adds to the quality. But mostly, it really is different in that way. With the published book, say with Manning, it's really a finished thing. It's done. It has to be really good before it's going out. And with LeanPub, I still feel that I can change things and improve things and just do a re-release. And that's one of the great things, because with Manning, I was constantly annoyed, for instance, that I could not make a change and it would just propagate to the released version. That would be very, very helpful. I recognize something or I change my mind about something and I want to change it and there you go. And with LeanPub, of course, that's possible. So I guess for the reader, it also must be a different experience where they get a book and it's maybe not even done or never done.
Yeah, no, it's so fascinating to think about it, from both sides of the equation. Well, I guess all three sides, right? There's the authors, there's the publishers, and there's the readers, right? And so, from the readers, this is actually reminding me of what I took to be a hilarious kind of profile of the CEO of Ford in the New York Times that I read recently, where so basically Tesla just did laps around the legacy auto industry in a number of different ways, right? And one of them was the overnight software update, right? And you can just imagine heads explode. I'm going to be very patronizing about this. You can imagine heads exploding around a boardroom where it's like, what, the computer guys are beating us at cars now, even after all these years and all these pressures and the humiliation of seeing Tesla worth 10 times as much, and some of these companies almost collapsing after the 2007 kind of, the beginning of the Great Recession there and stuff like that. I'm making a point. I will get to the point, but this article was celebrating the CEO and the release of the F-150 Lightning, their new electric truck. And but even at this moment, he couldn't help but get a jibe in at the damn computer nerds. And he said, this thing about these software updates, we really had to, it really took us a lot of kind of cultural change to get used to putting out a product that wasn't perfect.
Yeah.
because in the old, in the way we in automotive engineering, we don't put out things that need to be fixed. Mm-hmm. Right. And so, first of all, to characterize a software update as just a fix of a problem, you got to know that that's just not true, right? Like, but what Tesla was doing was also introducing new features, and this is what would have blown their minds, for free. Because the whole legacy automotive industry has just put out the new thing, but with a new gizmo attached, and say it's the 2010 model, and you need to buy that. And the idea also that like conventional automotive engineers would have never released a product with any deficiencies is just absolutely ludicrous. But I bring this all up because there is this kind of like this kind of interesting cultural kind of like gear grinding between self-publishing and publishers, where like you can imagine a sort of development editor at a conventional publishing business, and like all the people there saying like, what's with this sort of whole lean pub type process where it's like you just put something out there and change it later if there's a problem. That's just not serious.
That'll be good.
And it's kind of like I totally get it, and it's a totally different way of doing things. But the other side of it is like, but bugs or mistakes or do come through, or for example, one of the reasons LeanPub exists is because if you publish a book the conventional way on an evolving technology, that technology between the 6 months when you submit your final manuscript and the book finally comes out, something in that underlying technology might have changed, and your book might be obsolete before it comes out. So there are these there are these very important reasons to do things the way that conventional publishers do a lot of things, but there are also just things that process misses and can't accommodate. And one of the things it can't accommodate is a programmer who's written the book, who's accustomed to being able to change and deploy things when they find problems or when they want to add something, and then they're told, no, you can't. And that can just be very frustrating.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's great that like LeanPub really does something here for this part. And yeah, it's also, I think, what programmers often call agility. We can change directions very quickly. If it feels like we're not doing something right here, we can abandon the entire idea sometimes even and say, okay, we are going to write a different book, or I allow myself to write a different book than I started out with. And well, it happened a lot of times. Also with this book, in fact, I was like, okay, it has to be recipes. I always start with this design statement to say it should be a 150-page book, simple, like short sections, just quick advice, basically, not too much explanations going on. And it's because that was with the architecture book, it was almost like a never-ending thing. Much more had to be said and written, and it could never be released in a sense. Well, it is released, but okay, that took a lot of time. And for this time, I want to be a bit faster, a bit more lean as well, to get the things out there and make sure that we don't lose time with that. Sometimes it feels like, in particular with PHP Stan and Rector, which are I think still quite new tools, that we shouldn't wait that long until they are like fully stable or something, although they are quite stable. But we don't have to wait until it's like this, like everybody already uses it. So I also want to push for the new things and be sure that everybody knows about it. So yeah, I wanted to be fast in a way.
Yeah, no,
this is the right place to do that kind of thing.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. That's another reason that sort of, where one of the reasons LeanPub exists, and one of the reasons that it is the way it is that like we don't really get this question like we used to, but someone might ask, why would I want to read a book that's only 20% complete? It's like, well, because it's about a new technology, and knowing 20% more than zero about it is good.
Already very valuable. Yeah.
Just on that note, so you mentioned, but when we were talking before we started recording, you mentioned you've actually built your own kind of tools for writing in LeanPub, and so you mentioned just now like how you sort of go around with your design principle for the book, and maybe summaries and outlines and stuff like that. So what's the tool or tools that you've built to help with your book writing?
Yeah, several things, in fact. So one thing that I used to be very bothered with is that or concerned about is that a book is outdated very, very quickly. Like with the Symfony book, I had to say, like, I'm not going to update it. It's going to use Symfony 3, but that's it. They are at 6 now. So in a sense, it's kind of wasteful that, the book has been written and it has been useful for some people, but no longer it is. And so for any new book that I'm writing, I want it to be like upgradable itself. So this means that I have to define all the dependencies that I need, any kind of frameworks, including their versions or libraries or the language versions themselves. And when I want to migrate the book to a new language version or a new framework version, that should be like a very simple thing to do. Like I can just change the version, regenerate the book basically, and see if anything breaks. So that was another thing that I wanted, is that all the code samples should be working code. It's just very easy to just write a snippet of code, and the earlier books, they were like reviewers would try the code and find out that doesn't work. So that no longer is necessary. Like the book basically verifies its own correctness. So that is, I think, a very good addition for making sure that the book is valuable not just this year but also in the next few years. Eventually, of course, like the main manuscript itself could be outdated because it gives wrong advice or things that no longer make sense because the world changes or something. But in the end, I think books can be more maintainable in the long run, like this.
So this is why the reason we leave this for the end of the interview, and there actually are some people who skip to the end just to hear this kind of stuff, but it's very in the weeds. So does that mean that the code samples in your latest books are all in unique text files?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. In fact, I usually write every example in different stages. So we start with version 0, which is just like the way it would normally be written if it would maybe be in a normal project, and it would follow framework documentation. Then version 1 is a slightly improved version. Version 2 is and so we iterate until I'm happy. Sometimes it's like I show what I would test and then like gradually add more tests as well. So the book is actually test driven, developed in a test driven way. Then every version is its own sub-project, so installed with all of its own dependencies and just some tests that show that the example is correct. It's super interesting just for anyone who's interested maybe in writing their first Leanpub book, and it's a programming book. The way this would work is that the kind of what you would think of as the normal book content, the paragraphs, right? This will be in a text file, and you write your paragraphs, and then the next after one paragraph, you might want to insert a code sample. And the way one feature at Leanpub has is you don't have to write it in that same text file. You can point to another file that has the code in it. And because we've got that feature, Matthias has come up with this interesting way of since these you've got these separate individual files that just have unique bits of code in them, you can actually then run tests on those codes, on those files separately from analyzing the sort of book content text. Exactly. And you can decide if the test should also be in the code or like in the manuscript, or if you want to keep them out of sight, but just for your own like checking correctness of the code sample, that could work as well.
Oh, that's really fascinating.
Yeah, another thing that I added is that like you want to show different versions, but for the next version you want to maybe exclude part of the code that you have already explained something about. So you want to have // ... like as comments to say like, okay, I'm leaving this out here, and I created something for that as well. So you can say in the manuscript which part should be included from the script, like that you want to show, but also inside the code itself, you can say skip from here and like show the code from here again. So it's like jump in and out of the code. And that has proven really useful because usually if you leave out things from a code sample, it becomes incorrect, and now it stays correct, but it doesn't show up on the book page itself. So that's quite useful.
That's super fascinating. We always like to say we have the best customers because our authors are programmers. So many of our authors are programmers, and by best I mean help let us be a little bit lazier than we otherwise might be, or give us really good indications of things we can do because they're creators of the technology, not just the books and the content themselves.
But I'm very, very thankful as well because it's with Markua that this is possible. There's a lot of like I don't know how it goes with Markua, by the way. Is it still like something you support?
Oh yeah, no. So Markua. So for those listening, yeah. So for anyone listening, so there's this thing called Markdown, which is a way of sort of writing web content without having to type out all the HTTPS blah blah blah. So basically, it was like sort of shorthand formatting instructions that you would type in a plain text file instead of having to type all the formatting instructions out. And so my co-founder Peter created this thing called Markua, which is basically Markdown but for books. So the idea is that you specify all of the different formatting instructions that you might need to type into a plain text file to have a properly formatted book come out of it. And so Markua is fully specified, but it is not fully implemented on LeanPub yet. And we're hoping to have it, I mean, we've been saying this for literally years, but we're hoping to have it fully implemented sometime soon. But yeah, it is fully specified, and it's just just beavering away, trying to get it all fully implemented. And so if you create a LeanPub book, it's automatically in Markua 0.10 version right now. But hopefully, we're going to get to version 0.30, which will be when it's done, that'll be the sort of first example of a full implementation of it, where you'll be able to do basically everything you can imagine you want to be able to do if you're producing a book. You can write those instructions in plain text, and then LeanPub's book generators will know what to do.
Exactly. Yeah, it's always this discussion about like should we have yet another language to do this, right? Because there are alternatives, of course. But so far, I think like Markua is quite close to Markdown. And Markdown is very familiar for most developers, I think. So it's just a very easy thing to get into. Yet, yeah, you get all these extra things that are related to book writing. Oh yeah,
that's really interesting. I mean, like given the fact that you've been around for so long on LeanPub, you'll know what I mean. But like it was kind of a bet that Peter Armstrong, my co-founder, took on Markdown, right? Is this? Yeah, because there are lots of different ways of doing the same thing for everything, right? And yeah, it's interesting because programmers, of course, are familiar with Markdown and stuff like that. But more and more people nowadays are who aren't programmers per se are actually getting used to writing in Markdown, just partly because if you're getting into things like data science or something like that, these kinds of things can become more familiar. And also writing in plain text is something that people are becoming more familiar with as well, as opposed to in Word or something like that. Yeah. So it's interesting, and of course, there are other options, but ours is the best. With that being said, well, and it's I would venture to say that it is the best, and it's partly the best because if you can imagine being able to interact with authors like you with your level of sort of dedication and experience and technical sophistication over the course of 10 years, you're going to have a different product than you would with a different sort of form of evolution. With that said, the last question we always ask on the podcast now, if the guest is a LeanPub author, is if there was one terribly awful broken thing with LeanPub that frustrates you to no end that we could fix for you, or if there was one magical feature we could build for you, what can you think of anything you would ask us to do?
That's funny. Yeah. It has been fixed, I think. It was the problem where like for technical books, you always have these like mono font, or I don't know what the right word is, but like code samples in the text, like in a paragraph, and it wouldn't break onto the next line, or like there was some word wrapping issue there because it's really hard to say where to wrap or like break the word. But last time I checked, it was really great, and it was just breaking those words as well.
Oh, are you talking about how things would spill over into the margin?
Right. Yeah, I don't know what the word for that is, but that this would happen a lot of times where like the margin would just contain a bit of code, and it's like, okay, that's not nice.
I don't know the technical details, but like we did I'm putting in quotes finally, but actually I shouldn't put in quote. We did finally fix that a while ago, and so it's much more rare now than it used to be. But yes, our authors patiently lived with us for quite some time before we solved that problem.
Yeah, but it's very cool, and I mean, I always try to use like all of the power features. So I also have a command line tool where I can say publish a new version or give me a preview of the book, and yeah.
Oh yeah, you're using our API. We have an API for people who don't want to have to go onto some boring website like leanpub.com and click buttons. Instead, you can just sort of generate previews from your computer. Well, Matthias, thank you very much for taking the time out of your day to talk to me, and again, so many years later, and thanks very much for sticking around with us all this time.
Yeah, thank you for offering this awesome platform.
Thanks. And as always, thanks to all of you for listening to this episode of the Front Matter podcast. If you like what you heard, please rate and review it wherever you found it. And if you'd like to be a LeanPub author yourself, please check out our website at leanpub.com. Thanks.